Today, I'm going to be talking about whether or not it's worth investing in a fancy journal. I have three pros, I have three cons, and at the end of this video, I will give my final recommendation on whether or not it's worth investing in a fancy journal. So let's jump in. Here is pro number one of buying a fancy journal. It makes journaling a very intentional investment. What does that mean? The more money you spend on something, the more you tend to value it. And so if journaling is something you want to take more seriously in your life, then spending more money on the journal, it actually might help you journal more often and to take the practice more seriously. Investing in a nicer journal or a journal you're excited to use, it's a signal to your brain that this is a worthy investment that's worth time, energy, upkeep, all the things that come with spending a little bit more money on something. If you buy a super fancy Porsche, you're gonna maintain that Porsche a lot more carefully than a Corolla. No shade to Corollas, people love them. I'm just saying, if you invest a lot more into something, you're gonna demand a little bit more return on that investment. That is pro number one of getting a fancy journal is if you fork out the money for it, you're probably gonna wanna use it more often. But that leads to my number one con of fancy journals, which is it's more expensive. And it's not just expensive, but it also feels a little bit silly because ultimately this is just a notebook. You could go buy a notebook from the dollar store, or you could go spend $100 on a notebook from some fancy stationery store, but you will still just write in the pages all the same for the most part. So you're going to spend way more money for something you could literally get for, 1/10 the price. I personally feel that resistance in my head of like, I'm really going to spend all this extra money on a fancy journal for something I could get and have almost the same experience for 1/10 the price. That's a pretty big con. Okay, so that's con number one. Now we're moving into pro number two of getting a fancy journal, which is it makes the process more enjoyable. If you're trying to build a habit or do something hard in your life, it makes it a lot easier if you enjoy the tools you're using to do it. I'm about to run the 2025 New York Marathon, and I've been training like crazy to get there. And I spent way too much money on shoes, on gear, on fuel, all this stuff in order to help me run the thing and to make running enjoyable. I know it's helped me. Yeah, I spent an ungodly amount on my running shoes, but guess what? When I lace those things up, it feels amazing to go run. And the same feeling can go for your journal. If you have a tool that you love using, if you have a great journal that feels nice, it's going to be more exciting, or at least to me it is, to open that thing up and to use it more often. If you enjoy using your tools, you'll probably use them more. So that is pro number two of a fancy journal, which leads me to my second con, which is it can make you afraid to be messy. I used to have a lot of intimidation around buying a nice journal because I felt like I didn't want to mess it up. If you've ever seen like these YouTubes or these Instagrammers where they're doing like bullet journaling and their pages are just immaculate. Every line is perfect. They have their own like language for how they work in their journals, and it just looks so good and perfect. You kind of set yourself up to fail though if you think your journal should be something like that. That's super aesthetic, that's super perfect all the time. That's not what a journal is for, at least in my opinion. That's not what it should be for. But if you're buying this super nice journal, this super expensive journal, I feel a level of intimidation to like mess it up. And if you feel intimidated to mess it up, you might use it less, or you might just not use it at all. I am very guilty of in the past getting these big ideas like, oh, I'm definitely going to start journaling more, but I need to go buy a nice journal to get started, where the heart is good. I want to invest in myself. I want to invest in this habit. But then once I get the thing, I don't want to make it ugly or mess it up. So then it just sits on the shelf, not getting any use. So I think a huge con of investing in a fancy journal is the fear of being messy in it or not being perfect in it. And then it just kind of sits there and you don't get the right usage out of it. Or you can start editing your thoughts before you're journaling them out. It can just make it feel like you can't show up in your own messy, personalized way. Like you have to show up perfect for this really nice journal versus a cheap journal. It doesn't matter. You'll wreck that thing without thinking twice about it. And that's a good thing. So that's a big con for a fancy journal. Okay, and that leads me into pro number three of a fancy journal, which is it becomes an awesome keepsake. If you have a really beautiful journal, it's something that you'll want to put on a shelf and then pull back for years or decades. And the nicer the journal, the more likely that it will last. There's something cool about having a nicer journal as a keepsake. It feels more durable and it feels more timeless in a way that I think is really cool and a huge value add for investing in a fancier journal, because you're going to hang on to this thing for a long time. This is all stuff that you've lived through that you want to remember. You might as well put it in a really nice journal that you can hold on to and use as a keepsake for the foreseeable future. And I think that's a really huge plus of having a fancy journal. And that leads me to my third and final con, which is you can easily confuse the tool for the habit. What does that mean? I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think the idea of buying a fancy journal, it can kind of satisfy this idea in our mind that we've done something. I'll take the analogy back to running. So if I wasn't committed to running a marathon, and if I woke up one day and I said, man, you know what I should do? I should go for a run. But you know what I need first is a really expensive pair of shoes. I go to Fleet Feet, I buy the $250 Sauconys or Nikes or whatever you wear. I bring them home, and then I'm like, cool, well, I'll go for that run tomorrow. I'm really jazzed to go for that run tomorrow. And then the next morning comes and I'm tired, or I wake up late and I can't go on the run. And before I know it, I kind of substituted buying the tool with building the habit. That happens a lot for me. That happens a lot to a lot of people. But I think the same is true of a journal. We can kind of trick ourselves temporarily to think, once I buy the journal, then I'll become a journaler. The same way, once I buy the running shoes, then I'll become a runner. And neither of those things are true, but we can kind of trick ourselves into thinking they are. So that's a huge con in buying a fancy journal, is you can kind of trick yourself into thinking you've done something when in reality, you're not really that much closer to building that habit after all. Okay, so with those three pros, those three cons, here is my personal recommendation on whether or not you should buy a fancy journal. And my recommendation is yes, you should, with a couple pieces of understanding. But yes, I tend to lean a lot more on, if you invest in something, you'll get more out of it. Journaling is a massive part of my life, and it's a practice that brings so much value to my life that I would probably spend a lot more on a fancy journal because of how much value I get back in return. When I think of what I'll spend on some random dinner that's like mediocre, or what I'll spend on TV subscriptions, and then I compare the value of what those things give me versus what my journaling practice gives me, it's not even close. And so to me, yes, it is worth investing in a fancy journal if that makes you feel good, if you'll use it more, if it gets you excited to journal more often. 100% do it. I think there has to be the understanding, though, that you can't be precious with it. You have to be courageous enough to be messy in it, because if you're not messy with your thoughts, or if you're afraid to be imperfect in your nice journal, then you're not getting the full value out of journaling. When you're investing in the journal, you're investing understanding it's going to be an imperfect object that helps you work through your thoughts. And that's exactly what it's for. But yes, if you have the means, if you can afford it, investing in your journaling habit will be something you never regret. But hey, maybe you don't need all the mind games. You don't need it to be fancy. You don't need it to be fun to use. You don't need all these things. By all means, go buy that cheap notebook. You can get the same value out of it. Go for it. I personally find it difficult to get super stoked to use a cheap notebook that doesn't feel cool, doesn't feel personalized, doesn't feel very high quality. I know it's just a mind game. These are all mind games we're playing on ourselves. But if you're cool with that and you can keep up your journaling habit, by all means, go the cheap route. But if you're like me, where the tactile, the feel, the touch, the excitement of using your tools matters to you a lot, I highly recommend investing in your journal if you're able to afford it. That is my pros and cons of fancy journaling. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, feel free to sign up for my newsletter underneath. You can find the description below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back again with another video soon. But until then, keep up that journaling habit and keep thinking clearly. See you next time.